in 1985. Of course, picking up work, I needed to work in the courts of California. The appellate courts knew who I was, and they always need people to take appeals of complicated, hairy criminal cases. So they sent to me cases from Kern County, which were extraordinary. They were huge cases. They were like 24,000-page transcripts, and one of them, 7 people were convicted and sentenced to hundreds of years in prison each. More than any I'd ever, longer sentences than any that could be given at that time. And the job of an appellate lawyer is to read cold transcripts. You read and you write. That's all you do. You don't really get a great flavor of what happened in the courtroom. But these cases were outside the normal pale. They involved children accusing grown-ups of doing hideous things in organized ways, filming them all, sending films, and but they were, I remember reading, I had a sort of a revelation, because most of these cases people are guilty, not of exactly what they're charged for, they're guilty of something that brought them to the attention of the authorities. These cases gave me a different feeling. There was one child's testimony where the sense of his testimony, which was mainly supplied by the questions, was that he and his brothers had been sent to his natural father's house for every other weekend. And while they were at his natural father's house, somebody who was a bitter enemy of the mother, who was forced to take him over there, these kids described being molested and sodomized by groups of 15 to 20 and 25 people, molesting like 10 and 15 kids at a time, all under hot lights in a room that measured 10 by 12 that were filmed, made to snort lines of white powder that long, made to drink jars of whiskey and given an injection of needles that big, which might happen. People can be very depraved, and you can't rule out almost anything. But what I could rule out was the fact that these kids then went on to school Monday morning, and nobody ever noticed a thing. They didn't miss any class. Their mother, who was very jealous, didn't notice anything unusual. These charges all surfaced a year later. So I worked on the appeal along with 5 other lawyers. It was a big case. There were 7 people convicted at once. And I also worked at the same time on the case of a woman called Donna Sue Hubbard. These appeals were about to be routinely affirmed. The Hubbard case had in fact been fully briefed, and I was appointed, and I read the transcript and found facts that just alarmed me that the original attorney who dropped the case and went over to the Attorney General's office had not even bothered to include his brief. It suggested that there was a tremendous amount of pressure on this kid. In fact, the kid was hypnotized, literally. He was interviewed by a cop who was asking after about 8 or 10 denials to just lean back and relax and close his eyes. And the cop started whispering words to him in his ear, and the kids are echoing those words. And that is the first charge made against the kid's mother. We briefed the heck out of that appeal and ultimately lost it, but we won the first case, the Pitts case. It was we won it because a child in 1987 recanted. Out of the blue, we had a recantation. A kid told her uncle that none of that stuff ever happened, and this story made it into the Bakersfield newspaper. Once that story made it in the paper, other witnesses were bolder to come forward and say, well, you know, it didn't really work like that, or, you know, they were very frightened, because that was a time of great fear, a great community concern. Jury interviews expressed fear. People they were afraid for a very good reason. They were afraid because people who came forward to support adults who were charged with serious felonies to say, I've known those people, I've had them and their kids over to my house. This didn't happen. They themselves were arrested. Then people would meet in a group to make some sort of expression of concern. Police would show up, write down everybody's license number, do it in a very ostentatious way. So people were cowed, and it was really like a fever over that had infected everybody to a greater or lesser extent. And I mean everybody in this town. What happened was, that we learned later from research that I did with Lisa and with Debbie Nathan, my co-author for this book, was that it all began in Bakersfield, the Niffen McEwen case. And that case involved people who were solid, the prosecutions of people who were very solid citizens within the community. And that was successful in the spring of 1984. And it was voted the biggest story in Kern County of the year. Los Angeles psychiatrists and investigators had come over to help. There was a big concern then for this new deadly fear, the fear of satanic child abuse networks more powerful than law enforcement, capable of reaching across whole states. Keith Farland and other people had so testified before Congress. So there was the first big prosecution was in the McEwen case, but that was not really public. The Los Angeles investigation of Big Martin surfaced nationwide while the Niffen McEwen jury was deliberating. When the Niffens and the McEwens were convicted in the June of 1984, that triggered off a change of every single existing regular child molestation case in Kern County. There was about 8 of them. Some of them, there was real child molestation of a classic type where a father or stepfather was molesting a girl. Other cases were very dubious, cases where bitter custody battles, when one party would accuse the other of molesting the child in order to successfully gain custody of the child. Each of these cases got changed into a ring case. From the summer of 84 to the fall of 84, there was an investigation of some 8 satanic rings. And in the spring of 85, there was an effort to weave all these cases into one mega network and to plug it in with other networks in Los Angeles, in New Jersey, and other parts of the country. There were bigger and bigger cases prosecuted in Kern County. There was a system set up of interviewers, of experts, case investigators, of prosecutors that succeeded time after time in successfully convicting greater and greater numbers of people for greater and greater charges until they finally hit the wall with what was called the Satanic Church case, where they really overreached. There were some 60 children and 70 adults accused. But when the children began accusing a social worker who was one of the lead interviewers, the deputy district attorney, and the deputy sheriff of themselves being part of the Satanic Church, that's when the general community belief hit the wall. That's when the press switched. The media, which had fanned the flames and had published big pictures of heaps of pornography on the front page, pictures which, if you read the story, you would see had nothing to do with Kern County. Suddenly the media got skeptical and began asking the prosecutors to come up with evidence. Like in every one of these rings, there were photographs taken, there were movies taken. They were asked to produce one. There were none to be had. There was a variety of other evidence. There were supposedly sacrifices. The sheriff's office was asked to come up with some physical evidence of some sort of blood, bones. They were not only unsuccessful, but when the press began to investigate, they came up with 3 of the children allegedly sacrificed who are actually alive and well. And then the skepticism began to be pervasive. The Kern County grand jury then asked the state attorney general to investigate, because in the course of this fever, not only were criminal cases made, but there were dozens and dozens of children abruptly taken away from their parents and stuck in foster homes or in this sort of central holding tank called Shalimar for kids, and they would stay there for months and even years without any criminal prosecutions being brought. The grand jury asked the state attorney general to investigate the DA's office, the social workers, the sheriffs, to find out what was happening, and they did. The Attorney General spent a year investigating, interviewed players of every stripe, came out with reports condemning primarily the way in which children were interviewed. The process of removing kids immediately, just on they would literally drive around, and the kid would say, that, I think that house, the authorities would go into that house, take children away, and keep them for months, even if they had nothing whatsoever, any other sort of evidence at all, they would just keep the child. If they had even the spark of evidence, they would initiate criminal prosecutions. So this investigation by the Attorney General's office led to an abrupt cessation of these kind of cases. There were no more. But meanwhile, there were some 60 people locked up in state prison. We started to look into cases to see what we could do, because I became really skeptical of all the cases after the two that I knew very closely came apart. Then kids began to recant. In 1987, first Christina Hayes, and it was big news then. It was a front page story. Other children began to recant. Then significant numbers began to recant, and they said basically, well, nothing ever happened. And these kids, some of them, there was a dividing line. Kids who were 8 or 9 years old would say, well, it all seemed to be real. Like they were buying me toys and taking me out to lunch, and I was a hero. And then at night I would say, oh, what's going on? What am I doing? And they said the next morning I would be captured up and I'd be swept away again, and I would be convinced that I had to do whatever they told me. But what the kids did was never really a description of anything. In any of these cases, there was never a spontaneous description by a child of any act of molestation or the name of any person who was not described or presented to them by the interviewers. Tapes of the interviews became very valuable because these tapes made it clear that the police reports were deceptive. The police reports and the sheriff's interviews would say, we interviewed Ricky Shepard, age 7. Ricky told us that. And then there would be a narrative attributed to the child. A tape recording now shows that there was no narrative at all of the child. There was only denials, confusion, and finally an assent. It was an act of will more than a description, where the child would shift to agree with what the most powerful adults in his or her life wanted to say. How to overturn convictions is very hard to do. On appeals, you very rarely can overturn a conviction. And if something's overturned on appeal, the percentage of cases where you can actually bring a post-conviction act is super tiny. These were special cases, and we thought it could be done, because the first thing we had to do was come up with some explanation other than abuse that would be more plausible. We did that by showing where the first accusations came from. We were lucky in some cases to find discovery that had been suppressed and not turned over, which would be initial tape recordings. Tape recordings video recordings in particular, were thought to be, when child molestation surfaced as a serious problem, a wonderful thing. They were very powerful because there would be videotapes, usually of fathers in the 70s and early 80s, or videotape interviews of children, of their daughters, which would be so compelling that when shown to fathers, they would typically confess. And these videotapes were said to be an essential tool. So they were widely used, videotapes or audio tapes of interviews. But what the impact of these tapes were in the Kern County and in Martin in these cases was to make it clear that the star of the show was not the child, but was rather the interview. The director and the person who had the scenario in mind, what was happening, was not the witness supposedly describing it. The tapes were essential in McMartin and convincing the jury that these kids were not telling something from their own memory. They were likewise valuable in Kern County to show that the statements attributed to the kids did not originate with the kids. In every case, there was a system that also involved experts, because experts are incredibly powerful doctors. People we are told every day in every way that doctors like what they say. They say, folks, it was a matter of science, and we believe it's right. So if the kid is telling a hesitant story, is very inconsistent, but is a very sympathetic 7 or 8-year-old or 9-year-old child, on the other hand, you've got a parent protesting that none of this ever happened, it's not easy to resolve right away. But if a doctor comes in and says, using polysyllabic terms, that there's scientific evidence that there was chronic penetration in the child's orifice, that's going to nail the case down. We had to look carefully at this evidence, and that's where I met Debbie Nathan, my co-author of Satan's Silence. And Debbie's husband is a doctor. In the Pitts case, the first case, the doctor testified that every female child has a perfect little wedding ring hymen that measures exactly 3.5 millimeters to 4 millimeters, and anything larger than that is perfect evidence of abuse. And Debbie she lived in El Paso at the time. She had written to the Village Voice, and she had said she had gotten interested in this because of 2 matronly types at the YMCA in El Paso who had been accused of molesting several children and wearing bizarre clown outfits and walking them home and back, and she thought it was preposterous, and she wrote a story to that effect in the Village Voice in 1986. Somebody in the Pitts case had sent her a copy of the brief that we had written in the Pitts case, and she said offhandedly, by the way, the doctor's testimony was just wacky. That's not how it is. So I became interested in the medical testimony, which I hadn't really attended to before. Nobody had ever done any research at that time on the normal appearance of a child's penis or vagina. Nobody was ever curious enough to take the time to design a study. And finally, a doctor at the University of California did. He designed a study where he had 300 children filtered for non-abuse as best he could by first announcing generally that there would be 3 medical exams of kids from camp prior to summer, and getting a huge number of applicants, and then saying that they were going to look very carefully for signs of sex abuse. A certain amount of people were withdrawn. So finally, with 3 or 4 filters, he had a substantial population of kids that there was no reason at all to believe that they had ever been molested. So they began photographing with colposcopes their genital organs and their anuses. And he made a presentation at a conference in San Diego. Announced it jokingly, said, well, it took us 2 years before we found a normal hymen. Nobody laughed, because most of those people had testified about hymens being invariably perfectly round and not having any other shape. Signs that doctors had testified to that were proof of sex abuse were found in many cases, most all children. So we mounted an attack as best we could on the expert testimony. We then looked at the confessions. There was usually either confessions given, confessions are no longer beaten out of people, but there's a way in which in serious cases, confessions are supplied by jailhouse informants. Almost every time in Los Angeles or in Kern County, there would be somebody who would stand up and tell the jury that while in the jail, this person happened to confess to having, I'm sorry I did all these things, and will present essentially a confession. There was a system of presenting evidence that when we started to investigate, by we, I mean Lisa and I, taking on the Donna Sue Hubbard case that had been affirmed, and then the McEwen case, began to try to first come up with how did the case begin? Where was the motivation for it? How did the accusations first show up? How were they supported? What sort of evidence was offered? So we began to hire investigators to talk to kids and look at the actual medical reports. And we found doctors in each case who were willing to testify to the literature. I mean, it won't do for Lisa or me to stand up and say, this is not scientifically accurate. There are studies which refute it. We had to find a doctor, and we found a UCLA professor or somebody to actually present that. So we had to counter with our own kinds of expertise. And eventually, we were able to prevail on the initial case. the Niffen case, and the Hubbard case by dint of our own investigations. We had first won a couple of appellate cases, but then we began investigating, I guess, in '92 on the Niffen case, and spent about 2 years trying to figure out what had happened, marshaling the case, then presenting it. In another 2 years, the Courts of Appeals ordered the Kern County Superior Court to actually hear what we had done. We prevailed in '95, I think, with the Dynasty Hubbard case, in '96 with the Niffen case, and then the Modal case surfaced, and that's where these guys come in. There were 8 of these rings. One of them was called the Cox-Modal ring. There were 5 or 6 different trials, rather than having one huge central trial. And 7 or 8 people were convicted and sentenced to many decades in prison. One of them is here tonight, Richard Cox. And we got involved initially with the Jeff Modal case in, I think, in '97. And that case was started by this crusty old jailhouse lawyer named Joe Burton. And Richard Cox has said to me, I was in jail, I'll never forget, this all began when I prayed in 1988 in my cell for God to send me some help. And I could not believe that he sent me Joe Burton. So that's what happened. And I guess I'll let Joe talk about it, because Joe was the motor. Joe ended up initiating lawsuits that got 7 people out of prison. And when nobody else was, thought it was at all possible, all the best and smartest and brightest were thinking it can't be done in these particular cases. But Joe, why don't you talk about how you started, get the ball rolling?
How I got started reading in the first place?
Well, start whenever you want to begin.
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't know how to get started, but I think I got entangled with the justice system, say, in 1969. I was returned to prison as a parole violator 6 months after my fixed term of 10 years had expired. And I went back in front of the Board of Prison Bill Authority to determine sentence law in the state of California at that time. When you were returned to prison like that, well, all the time that you spent in custody was taken away from you under Resolution 171, and you were back on day 1. Well, I had a laptop. I had a reading comprehensibility. It was fairly decent. But we were not allowed to write writs, present law, of any description. If you were caught with a brief in your hand, you went to the hole. Well, I was pretty crusty. I was pretty mad. And I was returned to prison for no crime involved, leaving the county without permission. And I'm back on the laptop. So I went to the board in 18 months and got turned down another year. So I didn't know what to do. I lost my wife. I couldn't write her because I couldn't get her approved correspondent list. So if you couldn't write her, you couldn't get her approved. So I wrote the judge of Marin County Superior Court a letter. He treated it like a written habeas corpus, and he granted me the evidentiary hearing. And he asked me, could I show proof? I showed him my disposal slips, non-approval on the bar, that I'd get on the bar every time I sent out a letter. So he granted it, and I explained to him about how the bill authority treated me. Well, he said, we have no jurisdiction, Mr. Burton, of the board. I said, well, you send a man to prison. I said, why the hell can't you get him out? Well, he said, I don't want to tangle with him, but I will grant you writ on mail visiting. So he changed and altered the whole mail visiting laws, and he gives us permission to write anybody who could or wanted to, visit anybody 18 years older, proper ID. And so I wrote the Federal District Court in Northern District of San Francisco and explained the situation, and we were civilly dead at that time, we were as prisoners. And he granted me a show cause, and he impounded law libraries in all state institutions in California, including county jails and prisoner access. Well then, at that time, then we had a voice. But besides that, it was 4 years before I gained release, and I wrote my own writ and gained release after that in 1974. And my mother hired a young attorney at that time, and he met me in the courtroom that morning, and he told me, he said, well, Joe, I don't know what to do. He said, I don't know how to handle these eggs calls. I said, well, you give me full bird. Give me a shot at it. I said, all right. Well, that attorney today is a Superior Court judge in Bakersfield, California. And I see him there so often. Well, in 1991, I just returned from Arizona, and I worked for a farming company over there for about 10 years, whatever. And a friend of mine asked me to come out and see a cutie out of the county jail. Visit with her. Well, I don't pass up any first basic, it's kind of a backlog on me anyway, And so she attracted my attention. She's going back to jail on parole violation. And she asked me if I'd ride her and visit and so forth like that. And the next thing you know, a woman does, or she wants you to put money on her books. Of course, I was weak. So when she got out, a year later, well, we come tangled up. And boy, that's about 45 days she's out. And she pulled my car and got busted. Back in jail she is again. He's crying. So I went down and went to her defense. But she still had a parole and probation violation, and so she had to serve that. And I asked the judge at that particular time if she had propositioned me about getting married. Well, no, you can't use my courtroom. Well, I went up and got the license, went to Judge Randall, and got the ring to be married. And she went back to prison. But she came out, I picked her up, we started together. Oh, I've been with her a few months. She began to tell me about how she went to prison in the first place. Well, I didn't want to fool with it much, but somehow, you get attracted to injustices if you feel that you know a little something about it, And so we couldn't live together because she was on drugs and I didn't use, and so it didn't fit the situation. Well then, I was talking to Richard one day, and he said, if you'll see how I went to prison, he said, I'll give you some papers, and he gave me some official reports and stuff, and I was reading them. I told him, I said, how the hell did you convict me? He said, to read his official reports, you have to have a lot of margin. When an 8-year-old girl relates and tests and states she's been sodomized, raped, subjected to a dildo, etc., and they don't have a medical report of this, when they try these people, something's wrong in my catalog of thinking. And so, all this, several different situations that came up, and I told Richard, I said, so I went to work on Jeff Moore's case. I had never met the man, never seen him. So I said, if I can get a recantation, there's 4 children involved, if I can get a recantation from him, I think I could do something with it. Well, he said, you'll be the person. I said, let's get around and talk to the kids. I finally got hold of them one by one. And they had different statements to tell me. I took down their statements. I got a declaration from each one. So in 1996, October 15th, I filed a writ for Jeff Moldall. And got a show called order on December the 1st. So about the 15th of December of 96, Teresa called me from Stockton. She lived in Stockton and she was working for the city. And she had 2 little girls. So in California, under sex offender law, you have to register to an IPC. So the parole agent, she could have her children during the daytime, but she couldn't have them at night. She had to work all day for money kept her at night. But she got busted for 2 IPC, and she's back in jail, and she called me and crying. I said, I'll see what I can do. So December the 26th, I wrote her a petition about her show call. in January 10th, she was out. So we went up for our evidentiary hearing on whether I could get her judgment set aside, so we released, we sent it to order 290PC of registration. And the judge denied me, due to the fact he claimed that the restriction of the 290PC was not enough to implicate the age college. And of course, I was a little bit perturbed over that, so in August of '97, we got a hearing on Jeff's, on an evidentiary hearing as to whether the recantations were suitable to go ahead with the habeas corpus. And he ruled, Judge Westman ruled that they were. So the lawyer we had at that time, by the name of Jean Payton, she said, Joe, she said, this is going to be a little bit too heavy for me. So she came out the house, she picked up some tapes and some logs that I had of Bella. I had found out where she had taken these children for a medical examination in October 22nd of 1984. Well, at the trials, there's no medical examinations turned up, even pursuant to the discovery motions of the main law attorneys. And they claimed that the children were not examined. Well, here I find some log that they had been. I found another log of Elmer Curry. He was a counselor for Carla, and she had recanted to him several times, and he had taken one, and he called the fellow Merle and child abuse coordinator. She told him it was too late now, and she wasn't interested, and she had other people on trial, and these people were already in prison. She didn't care whether this child was recanted or not. Well, I don't care, that would still make me a little mad, you know. And so I told Richard, I said, well, we're going to have to hire another lawyer. So we hired Michael Snetter here. We became acquainted, and I kind of supported him every angle sent him. We won the case. Jeff got out. So then I took up his two stepsons' case and won them. Then in 2001, I opened up Teresa's case again. And I'll never forget, on the first day of the habeas corpus I drafted, well, the judge, Judge Gilder, he called me a self-styled friend of court, I met her. But of course I can't see it that way because I look at it like this. If you can practice the justice system and you can show somebody that's been illegally incarcerated or it's not a proper, well, I think it should be commented, not discouraged or hold animosity toward it. But of course, the judicial system in Kern County is not that way. And since then, I've got Richard's case overturned. I got another lady's case overturned. And I was told on Richard's case, because he had to accept the plea bargain when he got out after 6 years, that couldn't the plea bargain couldn't be rescinded, but I got rescinded and thank God. And so to me, I feel pretty good. So I thank you for your attention. I'm married now, I'm not available.
So,
If Richard cares to talk?
you want to add anything, Richard?
There's not really much I can add after what you went through.
You trying to say I'm talking too long or something?
I've known these guys for 3 years, and the word ratio is about 19 to 1. It's very consistent.
I'll ask you all a question. Guess my age.
82.
Huh?
82.
They read the article.
I used to like her.
No, they read the article from the Californian.
Oh, did you?
Yes, we do.
You know, I know it's not about her. You know, one of these girls got back there, she embarrassed me something terrible. You can't keep guys off from me.
Joe got the ball rolling, and then Richard had gotten some money.
Oh, what, Mike?
Right.
Commissioners, but I would like to make one other comment. You know, I had my wife's case in front of Judge Russell, and there's the judge had walked out of the courtroom for a second, and the district attorney and the prosecutor walked over to me and he says, Bert, he said, I'll have you know I started these cases in 1984. I said, well, something disturbing you because I'm going to recover a little miscarriage of justice or something? He said, I can prosecute you. I said, I'm listening. He said, for practicing law without a license. Well, I said, if your system of justice is that flaky that no country boy can get up and strike your case, and I'll challenge you. Come on. Well, you won't talk to me now, no. I don't think that's a substantial reason. But he's a judge now.
Does anybody have any questions, or Lisa, is there anything else that we
Well, what I'd like to do is, could you speak about the next stage, which is the civil cases, without, I realize it's in litigation, but if you could at least outline it procedurally, and how many people are involved, and sort of what's the remedy? Because one thing that has come up is, what can be done for people. And then perhaps we could take a break, and then come back, and then I would like to open it up to questions.
Okay, the remedies available they are basically civil rights remedies. Congress passed a law in 1873 giving people the right to go to the federal government to sue for abuses by state or local governments. And the reason for that law was primarily because shooting a black person in the South was just never taken seriously, and the only way you could ever prosecute anybody or recover any damages was going to what were then regarded as carpetbaggers in the South. The civil rights law was active for a while, and then it died off until the early 60s, and the U.S. Supreme Court gave it new life. And so people are now allowed to sue if a government official, anybody who works for the government or on behalf of the government knowingly violates your constitutional rights. These were the huge numbers of these cases in the 70s and 80s, but then the U.S. Supreme Court began to pull back by finding people to be immune. Prosecutors are considered absolutely immune, or you can have qualified immunity. You're immune absolutely if you're a judge. And a prosecutor, even if in the course of preparing your case you suborn perjury or do really bad things, but you're considered to be immune, and want to leave you a lot of slack and room so that you're not looking over your shoulder when you prepare a case to prosecute. But there are still ways of suing. You cannot, the Niffens sued, Scott and Brenda Niffen, and even though they had both been in prison for well over a decade, they finally settled for a relatively small amount of money because most of the abuses that they had suffered were at the hands of district attorneys or district attorney investigators. So they didn't have much of a lawsuit. The law is really strange in that it's like medieval theology. It's very weird. It's, yeah.
Who did you say they sued to get the settlement? What, the prosecution?
They sued the case investigators, the social workers who did the initial interviews, the sheriffs, and the county attorney. After a summary judgment motion, everything was thrown out except the first interview of each of the boys by the two women who had interviewed them the first day. They were the only people against whom a lawsuit lay. And the boys laid their most vivid memory of being coerced was of these district attorneys. So
Maybe you could explain suing individually, suing under color of state law, and suing counties, municipal liability, just in 2 minutes.
well, what you need to put, the big difference between, let's say, school and court is that in school you can talk about real things. You can talk about what's happening politically, what's happening socially, what movements are moving, what are not, what should be happening, what should be, but it's all kind of removed. It's just people talking in a classroom. The law is very bizarre and arbitrary. The discourse is like you're talking about procedural defaults, and it's all very complicated. It's horribly, you can misstep really easy. But what's at stake are large amounts of money or liberty or even death. It's very serious stuff. And the civil rights law to explain, like municipal liability, there's a whole lot of really tricky concepts. You've got to like step through hoops, and if you ever pause too long, you're out of court. And people have qualified immunities, absolute immunities. You can sue municipalities for certain things, sheriffs, but not district attorneys, or in another county, the district attorney, but not the sheriff. So they sue, the typical thing is you sue everybody in sight and then battle, and I mean really battle, over who will remain standing after all the immunities and the procedure, the liabilities are sorted out. Then you can actually finally go to court. And suing cities can be done if you can prove that there's a municipal policy. If something's being done by either the city itself or by, say, some policy maker, like a district attorney. If the DA has instigated by himself or by herself a certain policy, or if they know about it but don't do anything to stop it, then in theory you can sue them. But now they're considered state actors, and you cannot sue a state. The states, by the 11th Amendment, are immune from suit. So DAs have been removed as of a U.S. Supreme Court decision. So it's a snarly mess. I mean, it's at least as complicated as all of criminal law. So we're thrashing around in it on behalf of Jeff Modal, and we have done very well so far, but we're suing the case investigators, and we're getting someplace because it's a more traditional beef. We're suing them not so much for coercive and directive interviewing of children, which is nothing that was in the Constitution 100 years ago. It relies on relatively new research done by cognitive psychologists and an extension of the law about bad confessions. And what we have in the case that Joe has initiated and the Cox and Modal ring is really suppression of exculpatory evidence, Brady error. It's the kind of thing that all judges have seen. The prosecutors they tape recorded the first interview of the first child in this ring case. They were asked by the counsel, give us all tape recordings of all children. The judge ordered them to turn over all tape recordings of all kids. They sat on it. There was, as Joe said, a medical exam for one child, the one who had testified against him, was on October 16th quoted as saying that she had been subjected to repeated full, savage penetration in all of her orifices by big, strong, hairy men and by big, long, bumpy dildos. It was grotesque. They had asked for medical reports, and the judge ordered that any and all medical reports be turned over to the defendants. Well, it turned out 12 years later that, in fact, 5 days afterwards, a social worker had driven this child to the Kern County Medical Center for an exam for traces of sex abuse. And a doctor who was at that time trained, and medical doctors would then say if they found absolutely nothing, they would write consistent with sex abuse. Because in 70 to 85% of all cases, there is no physical trace. It would be fondling or... So they would almost never say no. But in this particular report, the doctor wrote no sign whatsoever of any sex abuse. And he had a very long and detailed account of this exam. This report was buried. It was not turned over. So and it turned out, and they said that they didn't know that it happened, but the original charges were for all this charges of forcible sodomy. But when they actually went to court, only 11 days later, the child witness testified only to fondling or to activities that would not leave any physical trace. It's very clear that the prosecutors all knew that the results of this exam, and were sculpting this child's testimony to reflect that in case it would ever surface, right? Well, it never did turn up, and the only reason it turned up was because my co-counsel in Kern County goes to the same synagogue as this doctor. And he asked the doctor, because this girl, we had this record that Joe had found, this log from the holding tank for the children, saying that Bella Morello had checked them out, taken them to Kern Medical Center where they had been for 4 hours and they had come back. she said, yeah, well, I got an exam, but we asked for an exam, got a release, and they didn't turn it over. There was nothing in the hospital. So then this lawyer stands there and asks his buddy, the doctor, who's now like 70, 75 years old, you know, Jess Diamond was his name. He said, can you find this? And he said, well, why don't you ask him? He said, well, no, we've asked him, and they haven't turned up anything. He said, well, there is a record I know for all the exams that I used to do. I don't remember. I don't have any idea. He did about 2,000 of these. But I'll look and see. So the doctor called my co-counsel the next day and said, go back to the hospital tomorrow morning with your release. So Stan did, and we got the report, which says it's going to be, you know, the basis of Modal's freedom. This guy was in, people have been sentenced to prison for decades, and they were able to get out on this chance relationship between the lawyer and the doctor. Which is these DNA cases in Chicago. It's sort of when people say the fact that we now are exonerating people sentenced to death, or in these three cases prove the system works, are overlooking the fact that many of these cases were overturned by sheer chance. In Chicago, it was a journalism class, or a class not that different from this one, where the professor said, well, let's just poke around. And they started poking around in a couple of these capital cases and came up with what turned out to be decisive evidence showing that the people convicted and sentenced to death were not the perpetrators of the crimes for which they were convicted.
And that's in our course reading packet. We'll study that in the second half of this course. So, oh no, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Let's hold questions. Let's take a break. And how about 5 minutes? 10 minutes. Let's say 10 minutes.
He was completely exonerated. It wasn't him. In fact, there was somebody else who had a prior of raping a 12-year-old who was seen a half a block away, who they should have known about because but they had focused in, which is a real danger. It's one of the overall reasons for wrongful convictions is that there's tremendous pressure on the police, particularly for a very bad crime, to solve it. If an 11-year-old girl in a well-to-do neighborhood of a prosperous town is raped, I mean, people are upset. They're really oppressing the police to get the person who did this and get them off the streets and out of the way. The ambiguity of having somebody like that around is bad. So the police will typically it's a reversal. The more serious it is, the more likely to make a mistake it will be because they are being pressed from all sides, internally as well as externally, to close the case. Well, it turned out that they had, because of the coercive interviews of the girl, and she had recanted, by the way, which led to the DNA tests. There was a civil suit, and in the wake of settling that civil suit for $3.5 million to her, they completely rearranged how they do things in San Diego County. So it's a major incentive to change your ways, because county agencies have budgets, and they don't like to pay that kind of money.
May I follow up with that and talk about the sort of effect of the hand over the rope? In other words, Mike and I funded Hubbard out of our pockets, but then meanwhile the professor in Stanford was paying for Weimer, so there was some money there, and then we funded something else with Niffen because there was money in Niffen, and then we funded something else because there was money in what was it? You know what I mean? It's like in Modal, and then so some people don't have money, some people do, and you just keep pulling. And what we're, you know, it'd be great, of course, if there were a recovery in the next few years for Richard Cox and all those people, not only for their own personal situations, which are unspeakably egregious, but so that money could be freed up to fund then other people's vindication. And if we had the money to, you know, go for some other case somewhere, we would probably do that. So,
It's true that if you do whatever you think is most important, like I did work for $45 a week, but because I could do whatever I wanted, and I did cases that attracted interest, and later when I needed to make money, I also had a nice place to live in San Francisco along with that walking around money, but people were aware that I existed and would call me up. And likewise, because we've done these cases and have done them well, then money will follow. If you do something that's important and you do it well, things will work out. If you aim directly at money, you might miss. Any other questions, either about Kern County or about Satan's Silence while I'm here? Yeah.
Well, I had a question about the civil stuff, since we're on the subject. How do you go about putting a price on the loss of time or the loss of a life? Because people sue civilly, like if I went and killed somebody, they'd sue me for civil damages. And how would they put a price on that person's life? I mean, how do you go about determining how much to sue for?
Well, I can answer that a little bit.
Okay.
The state of California passed a law a year ago last September that for illegal incarceration or erroneous convictions, that they give you $100 a day. But however, you have to go to the Board of Controls and pursue it through that action, into the governor, and see if you get it, and prove you're innocent. It don't make a difference whether they suppressed evidence against you or anything like that to gain a conviction.
Okay.
You have to prove you're innocent. I look at it this way. Show me anybody that wants to spend 15 years in prison for $100 a day. You won't get many takers.
No.
And I hit Kern County up on Jeff Woodall's case for $200 a day. They laughed at me. But I look at it like this. You can't change the laws. You can show that the law is not proper, or whatever we want to call it. However, the only way you can retract a case is through the pocketbook. If you get in that pocketbook heavy enough, they would do a lot of changes. Not only will they change the law, they'll change the people that's running it too.
Can the law be changed through case law though? Like if you get acquitted from a charge that was wrongfully convicted, and then other cases that would follow the same proceeding, wouldn't that be the case law precedent?
Well, that would only be a chain of command come down and said, like, if you had another light case or something like that, but you could use that to support the theory that the fact is it's not, it's not right. Setting proceedings, though, you can set a lot of procedures you don't track no attention to. It's just an everyday thing.
If you, the one area of the law that would change probably has been the whole area of whether or not coercive, directive interviews are a violation of due process. And they have never been considered as such. They have been in a way, like wrongful ID, suggestive identification. If a policeman shows you who are the victim of a crime, one photograph of one person, and you identify that person. There's been research on suggestive identification procedures, and the Supreme Court held 40 years ago that if you do that, then that's an unreliable identification. You can't use it. And there are confessions. If you, from the most egregious cases in the 30s and 40s, where people were reading confessions out of people, to modern techniques, if you offer a promise, if I promise you that your wife will get off scot-free, or that you can sleep with your girlfriend if you in jail at night, which these are kind of promises that are actually made, then whatever statements you make are going to be considered unreliable. But the directing children's testimony was never included until the 90s. I mean, the first cases we won, the Pitts case, was because of prosecutorial misconduct. And another case was won, the Stoll case, because he was not allowed to put on testimony from a psychologist and he tested normal. He argued that it's going to be relevant because the charges were that he had allowed his own child to be sodomized on film by somebody he only met 10 days before, and then also sodomized an 8-year-old child he had only met the day before and sent the kid on home for dinner. And that is so aggressive and so self-destructive that evidence from a psychologist that you test normally should be allowed into evidence to be considered by the jury when they're thinking about whether or not you ever did this. The courts agreed. But we did not ever reach the issue of suggestive questioning until these post-conviction cases. In the Donahue Hubbard case, it's a big, fat 300-page opinion, unlike the 4- and 6-page opinions releasing people from the Kern County Superior Court. But the Court of Appeal really got all the way into it, and they reversed her conviction because the interview techniques were so suggestive and so directive that there was a substantial chance that they would generate unreliable testimony. We had experts say, whatever this kid says has nothing to do with what really happened. We're not saying it did happen, we're not saying it didn't happen, we're just saying that all kids that question in this way are going to say that it did. So it's like throwing a stick up in the air. You might land east, but that's a random chance. It's not like...
But what's interesting about the Hubbard case that Mike's talking about, I think the opinion was 156 pages, and I'm actually going to, if I can remember it, I was going to put it on reserve for you, at least just come show you the opinion, maybe show you some of the pages in it, is that the court ordered it to be unpublished. Now, what does that mean? That means no one can cite the Hubbard opinion as case law, which is your point, Craig. If you cite to it, it's sanctionable. If you file a brief and you cite the Donna Sue Hubbard case, you can have your whole brief thrown out. Now, why did they leave it unpublished? Can you think of a reason they might have not published it? Yeah, Don.
Possibly, sorry, I'm eating and that doesn't help. Possibly to not bring attention to the fact that they were reversing a highly publicized case during the 80s. I mean, that's what I can think of.
Yes, they wanted to keep it quiet. Now, why would they want to keep it quiet?
Because the government never makes mistakes.
Well, partly, not quite, but close.
So they couldn't use it to overturn other cases?
You're warned. So, but where, this is the Court of Appeal. Whoops. Just the clue is that a Court of Appeal is an intermediate court. It's not the Supreme Court, correct?
It's like when you go to appeal, there has to be an error of law. I mean, to show error of law.
There were errors of law, but what it was is that if it had been published, the Attorney General was more likely to what? To appeal it, right? To go, how many more years would Donna Sue have had to spend in prison while the Attorney General appealed? Were we happy that it was unpublished? No. Were we happy that it was unpublished? Yes.
So they did it for
She
the
got out
good
3 months later.
So they did it for good and bad reasons.
They did it for reasons we'll never know, but the thinking would be to insulate the decision and to allow her to be released. So those are good reasons. But it's also to, as I was pointing out, look in the, excuse me, no, you don't have it here. Did I give you the Niffen opinion? Yeah, the Twisselman. I'm sorry, I'm getting confused. No, what's his name?
No, that's okay.
That's next time, right. I'm going to give you the Niffen opinion, which is like a 6-page opinion, to show you, I know this isn't a law class, but to show you how a judge can, what was his name? Stubbe. Judge Stubbe insulated the county of Kern from heavy liability. Because remember, we know from this newspaper article, and I thought that was a secret, the $275,000. But Mark Nation, in his candor, commented it up on the newspaper. But anyway, they were insulated from a greater judgment. But what happened when Judge Stubbe wrote the opinion, which you don't have in front of you, but you will, in such a circumscribed way, it meant that, guess how long, guess how many hours it was between the time the opinion was out and what you all saw in Turning Point when the Niffens walked out of jail. And that was the contemporaneous, that was not a replay, a redo. We were there, they were walking out of that jail, and they had allowed ABC in the jail. Guess how many hours it was?
Well, since you're asking hours, it must have been small.
It was 2 p.m. the opinion came out. We got it faxed at 4 p.m. We got on a plane the next morning at 6 a.m. and they were out at 11:55 a.m.
So less than 12 hours. I mean, 12 hours.
Less than 24 hours. Because Judge Stubbe, according to the people we heard, this is what we heard of, called the holding place out there, whatever it's called, where they put...
Lyric.
Yeah, Lyric, right. Called it sort of jail where they put people who were holding for trial instead let them out. Period. They got out because he knew within, like by 5 o'clock, the district attorney had said they weren't going to appeal. Well, because he'd given them a concession. He'd handed them a $275,000 judgment, essentially, rather than a $24 million judgment. And, you take that because they wanted their freedom.
The way he did that was by saying that we find no fault here at all. The reversal was because of suggested and directed interview of the kids. But he took great pains to say, we think that everybody tried their best here. There's no fault. No one did anything. That's how
That's
that's
true. Thank you.
Yeah.
It seems to me when the opinion is written, the way I would interpret it is that being no fault, they still have to hold the public opinion over their heads. And they walk out with a $250,000 check rather than being totally vindicated. In the eyes of the public opinion, because if they would have stayed in, they would have been totally vindicated through the court system. As not, they weren't already, but the way the opinion is, I'm interpreting, no fault of us, I want to no fault of you, so if the hourglass happens to be full, then they're walking out free, but still.
Right, actually, that's an excellent point. Did you all understand this point? Okay, the point is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that they walked out on an error, which the judge could have, you could almost read that opinion, which you will read in a couple weeks, and say, well, it almost sounds like a technicality. Well, we all tried our best, and we didn't know that this kind of questioning affected children so much, and but everybody's acted in good faith, but there's enough suspicion here, and in parentheses, and they served enough time, a lot of time, 12 years, hard time, that, well, we'll just go ahead and reverse the judgment. He didn't say let him out, he just said reverse the judgment. So Craig is saying, that doesn't mean they're vindicated. It doesn't mean there's a finding of actual innocence. It doesn't mean squat, really. But what happened was the DA didn't retry. That's a clue. The real vindication for the Niffens, in my view, came in 2 ways. The Turning Point video, which came out the same year they were released, and the Lifetime cable channel for women movie that we're going to watch, I think next week. And it's the funniest thing, this funny little Lifetime for Women, that's what it's called. When that movie came out, that proved their innocence. Now that's the court of public opinion. Okay, questions? Yes?
How did ABC News know to be there when the Niffens came out of jail, of prison?
Due to state silence, they had contacted me and Debbie, and they wanted to know about cases. In the Niffen case, the Satan Silence was published in November of '95, and Lisa and I had just gotten an order. I think the Niffen case was hot. And the Turning Point people were on this general subject. They had filmed another trial, Jenny Wilcox, where there was Elizabeth Loftus and some other well-known people, apparently in Ohio. They had filmed that whole trial and interviewed the judge. They were all over this issue, but they were all over the country. They interviewed just about everybody. And the paradox, the reason why they ultimately chose to focus in on the Niffen case was because of Andrew Gindis. Had he not, nobody else from the
Do you remember him?
prosecution side-
Andrew Guinness, the district, the prosecutor, who said the house was too clean to be believed? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
It was Andrew Gindis, the opposing person, who set up the conflict and gave them attention. And Howie, the producer of the show, who wrote it, mostly Howie Masters, said later, well, we were about to go with Wilcox, but when Gindis agreed to appear and be interviewed, and they came to Kern County, interviewed me for 3 or 4 hours, Gindis for 3 or 4 hours, and the Niffens in jail before the hearing, just on the eve of the hearing. They were there for the whole thing. They filmed it all, and that was given us this great gift to them. I mean, if he wouldn't have shown up, then there would have been, difference would have been one sentence rather than 1 hour.
Tim?
Just at a philosophical standpoint, a lot of us are going to be out there in our own way changing the system. The system was, the justice system was originally created to be separate from the political entity. However, through time and corruption, etc., it has become extremely moved by political fancy, etc. What kind of things do you suggest to us that we either look out for or try to do in order to help change that in our future careers?
That's a really large one. I think the justice system is so intermingled with the rest of culture and society that its strengths and its weaknesses are those strengths and weaknesses of this country. And I think it's a help to have judges that are not running for election, because that requires money, and money requires favors, and it takes a lot of money. And as we get away from sort of a party system where you deliver goods and you return to a media system, it takes a tremendous amount of money. I know in metropolitan areas, in Oregon this year, the race for Senate is going to take monstrous amounts of money. And to the extent that you can remove the whole process of determining guilt or innocence, or without involving people who've got to run for election on a frequent basis, I think that's a significant change. The risk is you'll get lifetime appointments of somebody who's a lemon, but you can also insulate people who are really capable. And the system now, in some ways, where state judges are usually elected in a really, as they were in 1873, caught up with local politics. And judges are typically friends of governors or people who've done favors for them and given them money often. The federal system is to have people who are more removed. They're appointed for life. If you're on the federal bench, you're there, no matter what. And that is a way of checking and balancing. And generally, that's a good thing, because power does corrupt. And you can have people sensing, have a trip to the state system done by people who are aware that they're being watched is a potentially good system. But, you know, crime fighting is a competitive enterprise, and being tough on crime was the ticket for, the governor of California paved the way. He won by saying death, 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 morning, noon, and night, and that worked. As crime was coming up, as the baby boomer bubble was moving through and crime rates were increasing, it was the issue. So the people now appointed to the bench in many parts of the country were appointed by people who saw that the crime issue and being tough on crime was the only way to fly, and that not only was it a matter of policy, like Bill Clinton was tough on crime, he even went back to Arkansas to witness an execution, but he didn't make it the cutting edge of his campaign. There are plenty of politicians, not all Republicans, most of Republicans, who made that the front and center piece of their whole reason for asking for your vote. And there you have an extremely politicized system. And this is the system that was in place, for example, in Kane County. You had Jagels, the people who were in power there and the people who were in power above them were people whose discourse was dominated by crime and punishment. That was what they ran on for more, all day, every day. And so the system was so politicized that prosecutions were made or not made depending on the political advantages they would bring to the people who were doing it. And that is the kind of system guaranteed to make serious mistakes.
I would like to take your questions and turn it over to some of the rest of you. When we started this class, the open information, we began by finding out a little bit about each other and where people intended to go with their careers and why people were majoring in administration of justice or not, or why they were in this department taking this course. And so can you imagine just, momentarily where you might be in your career and how you might have an impact on, say, a case like Richard Cox's. You know, where might you run into a case like that in your future? I think I remember you, Monique, were interested in becoming a child psychologist. So it's an easy answer for you, how that might come. Would you like to comment on that? Yeah, this is given in the context of the cases we studied and in the context of Kern County.
Well, I'm especially attracted to foster kids and that whole area, so I would think that abuse charges would possibly come up a lot in that field, so.
Some of which are very real. And so then you have to think, well, say you get, you know, you have these voices in the wilderness, these people in prison writing or somehow getting the word out that something has happened that's wrong. You know, you can pay attention to that possibility and not ever be so jaded that you think, oh, that's what they all say. Even though that is what they all say, but still.
I was particularly interested in when they were talking about the wink test, about the hymen and everything. And being having a master's degree in psychology, have you heard other theories that weren't supported by the DSM-IV, which, like perhaps in your case testimony by the prosecution, that you had to have them throw out because it wasn't in the DSM-IV?
Well, one very, another way of supporting children's testimony, in addition to doctors, was with other mental health experts and professionals. And child sex abuse accommodation syndrome was cited by several professionals, and it was generally thought that this particular syndrome had been established by reputable science. It basically was offered by the prosecution to explain why a child might deny having been abused, why they might be inconsistent in their statements. And some of it wasn't until the person who wrote a very influential article, Dr. Roland Summit, a UCLA psychiatrist, and it was cited, and there's 100 legal cases around the country that have considered whether or not this should be admitted into evidence. And it has been finally generally allowed into evidence not to sort of corroborate the kid or have an expert get up, in the course of the rule. You can't just say this child probably was abused because she usually, or sometimes he, suffers from the child sex abuse accommodation syndrome. But it can be used in rebuttal. If the defense challenges the validity or the reliability of the kid's testimony, that a professional who will be qualified to the jury as an expert, so the jury knows this is an expert speaking, will tell the jury that this child exhibits the behavior of an abused child because he or she has denied and he or she has made inconsistent statements. And this is what abused children typically do because and there are reasons why a child might deny if it's going to threaten the family structure. Well, it was not until we, in our book, really began to scratch and we came up with the fact that Roland Summit, in his, the facts emerged in a deposition in Florida that he had actually never done any research at all, and that this was strictly impressionistic. Not only had he never done any research on this syndrome, he had never done any research on anything. And so now people are beginning to see that this was just a sophisticated way of getting a person labeled as an expert to get up and say that this child has been abused, regardless of what the child said. I mean, there was, in 84 and 85, if the child said that he or she had been abused, well, you would take that at face value. If the child said that he or she had not been abused, then that also was evidence of abuse, because children who are abused typically do not. So that syndrome is now fading away, but there was a time when it was regarded as a breakthrough of scientific research into the behavior that people so much wanted to know the truth or falsity of these charges that they just quickly accepted this, and it spread like wildfire.
And think, what does that do to the jury? Now think, you're the jury. What does that do? If an expert gets up and says, a denial means the child was abused.
Well, he's an expert, so why wouldn't I believe him?
He's an expert.
And because I don't have experience in that
Right.
field.
And what's left to decide? Nothing. Exactly.
And the judge is also validating the testimony
Vouching?
of the expert.
Exactly. Vouching is a classic problem with this kind of error. And the term used to be usurping the function of the jury. Now it's more like a mega due process problem. But I like usurping the function of the jury. Like in the old days, back in the medieval times, I think 16, 15, 1400s, what would happen was the way you'd be tried is you'd go hire people to get up and say to everybody that you didn't do it and that you were telling the truth. And whoever could hire the most people would be exonerated. Or if you could hire enough people, I should say, you'd be exonerated, when the courts were all very different. If you ever want to study the history of jurisprudence, I think that's fascinating. And they were called truth tellers, and there's a word that starts with a C that I've used.
Congregation.
Congregation, that's it. And that was the process of congregation. Well, several years ago, people began to say, well, wait a minute. When somebody gets up and says, rape trauma syndrome, this woman is suffering from rape trauma syndrome. Well, what does that mean? That means she was raped. Well, what is rape trauma syndrome? Well, it means she's sleepless, she's withdrawn, she's depressed, she's this, that, and the other. Well, then there's nothing left for the jury to decide, was she raped or not. Now, is rape trauma syndrome real? Well, maybe, maybe not, but it's also another form of congregation. When an expert gets up and says, I've examined this woman, she has rape trauma syndrome, it doesn't leave much for the jury to deliberate. Actually, Craig's question involved the link test as well, which is, I want to say that another way that you can take a lesson from this course is to your real life, is to be able to stand up in an audience and talk about somebody stimulating a child's anus with a Q-tip and calling it the wink test. Now, is that like a thing you don't want to say in front of people? It's like this trial, my first felony trial was this guy masturbating in public, and I had to get up in front of the jury in voir dire when I was in my 20s and say, does the word masturbate bother you? You know, well, I mean, that's hard to do. So Mike takes this Q-tip thing and spends, I don't know, 8 months looking into the wink test, talking to people about stimulating children's anuses to Q-tips. Like, you don't want to talk about this stuff. And I think one of the smoke screens in these witch hunt cases is the invention of things that are so hard to talk about that you'd rather convict people of thousands of years or hundreds of years than to ask the question, well, what about that wink test? Is that real? Like you just said. So the wink test actually has now been debunked, right, hasn't it? Yeah. So if you're a psychologist or let's say you become a nurse or a doctor and you're in an examining room and you have a protocol, which is what it's called when you do that, like a sex kit thing, or a child comes in and they're complaining or their mom is hysterical or they're bad or whatever. You want to be aware of things that look official, that maybe if you poke a little bit, if you sort of question a little bit more, you think, well, is that, I don't know, maybe I should think independently.
Yes. I was curious, in the front of Satan's Silence, you listed all these people.
Yeah.
And I remember we discussed in class a few weeks ago if you knew, like, anywhere, like, of where those cases are. I mean, I know, like, the Niffins are out and stuff that's in this book. There are some people in here that, like the Wenatchee, there's lots of people here in Wenatchee, Washington that
They're
were
all pretty
convicted.
much out.
They're all pretty much out.
Not everybody.
I think they all
Are
are.
they all?
Yeah. They all those convictions were overturned.
But they spent a lot of time in prison.
Yeah, Manuel Hidalgo, there's one guy got sent back to Mexico behind it, and he is now attempting to have that deportation overturned because there's no longer any basis for it. But otherwise, everybody's out.
Everybody that's in the front here, or?
Everybody from Wenatchee.
Oh,
The
okay.
Wenatchee.
Most of those people are out. One very famous case is going to be on PBS in this March, the Frank Kuster case.
That would be a good one for somebody to do their final on.
That's Janet Reno was the main prosecutor of that case.
Oh, Ileana, his wife.
Yeah.
Somebody say who Janet Reno was.
Oh, she's the former attorney general.
Janet Reno, that was Attorney General of the United States.
That's,
She was the prosecutor in that case.
But that's the one I don't want to meet.
Oh, you don't want to meet her?
No, I wouldn't take her home with me, no.
You wouldn't? Would you take her?
No, well, now, that's different. She put money in gas in my car. Hey, I got a nice Cadillac, honey.
Self-serve, Lori. It's not self-serve.
No, it's not.
Juliana has come back
Also
on
it's
my door.
here.
And so that case is live now. That's been, there's a new petition in court in Florida, and Frontline has done a 1-hour show, and Ileana has completed her candidate, and it will probably, well, it's hard to say. Florida's a different world.
Now, Buster isn't in here though.
Yeah, he is.
F-U-S-T-E-R-Y?
Yeah, he's in one of the
Oh,
chapters.
there he is. Let's go, Buster. Okay, right. So that's what Eliana's titled. So if somebody's interested in a final topic.
Bernard Barron, yeah, that was going to be full of material right on the airwaves. It's due to show in March. I know a couple of his lawyers have just been interviewed by the producers.
But you're not saying that most people in here are out, are you?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But at the time of
Same
printing,
Huh?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, but at the time of printing, I can't remember if I read it in the book or if we discussed it in class.
You did.
There were some people who were not out of prison and whom did not have a case going to get out of prison at the time, and you put them on this list. I can't remember who they are.
Most of those, many of those people that was true of. The Wenatchee people, when we wrote this, they were, there was no Wall Street Journal columnists yet on the scene. They were being prosecuted busily in 1995 when that book surfaced. And Bernard Barron had nobody whatsoever in the world other than my co-author interested in his case. He was rotting away in Massachusetts.
Joe, would you like to comment about John Stoll?
John Snow?
Yeah, we've been working on John Stoll, not actively, but Joe recently brought a writ trying to get John Stoll, who's in here, out of prison and law, which I just found out today, actually. And,
Oh, I haven't lost.
no, you've lost right now, but you're gonna go on.
No, Mike kicked me off the case and he's gonna take it.
Oh, well, that's all right. But yeah, I mean, so it's just like, this is what this is made up of. You know, Joe tries to keep something alive, files a writ for John Stoll, who's served now, I think, 15 years? 17 years?
17. He's the one person left in Kern County who convinces.
And you know, that's one of the most interesting stories that you want to read. It's Jed Stoll with his son, he was 6 years old. Bill Murillo and Connie Erickson are the two investigators that took over the case. And it was Connie Erickson's first case. He was a deputy sheriff in Kern County. Now then, you can picture this. He went out to interview Jed Stoll, that was John Stoll's 6-year-old son that had been left there. His wife and him are separated, so she's going on a vacation with her lover. And she left the boy in John Stoll's custody for about a week or so, and she come back and took him back home, and about 3 months later, what she called the authorities and claimed that John Stoll had raped him and all this stuff, you know. So they go out to talk to the boy, and the first words that Bill Murillo asked him, says, I know that you had an affair with a little neighbor girl a year ago by the name of Donnie. Now this is a 6-year-old boy. Now that would make him 5 years old.
Did he have an affair with the next door neighbor daughter?
Well, Kern County thought it was. John Stoll got 40-some odd years. Now, he is accused of his 6-year-old son, 5 other children, 6 altogether, and the boys were 6 to 8 years old, and no medical report shown of any kind, and they were supposed to have been over, how many men, 3, wasn't it? 5 men raped, sodomized 6, 8-year-old boys, and no medical report shown. This judge tells me that I got recantations from 3 of the boys, that he didn't know who they were talking about. And it's in the investigation report of Connie Erickson and Bill Murillo. It is the same judge that released Jeb Modall. Of course, he knew I wrote the writ. And it didn't bother him. You know, I'm going to chastise him and let this go to the field. And so,
Well, what's really horrible about this case is that Mike won a
Well,
health Palomo, tell me about Palomo.
his co-defendants, Timmy Polano and Mike won that case due to the fact that the psychiatrist said claimed that he didn't fit the profile of a child molester. Well, now, you know, to me, what is a profile of a child molester? It could be you, me, or anybody else. Of course, I'm perverted myself, but I can't help it. You know, it's just a girl. And old women. Oh, well, the hell, if you can't have a little sense of humor sometimes, you won't make it. And I look at it like this. As I started reading these cases, you know, English, the law, the old English law is supposed to be based on common sense and simple logic. Well, as I read about these cases, and I read them, incidents that happened, I couldn't believe it, that a jury of 12 people would set up and take these as authentic, original, because to me they were created. So they got the hysteria so high in Kern County in 1986 or 1985 that they 8 major rings surfaced and convicted, and hundreds of years haven't let it out. So the grand jury asked the Attorney General to investigate. So he wrote up a report on the child abuse investigation in Kern County. Now the report came out in September 1986. Prior to that, I got a report of Velda Rowe at the house. She had this 12-year-old girl, she came out to the Cox Ranch. And the 12-year-old girl, 11-year-old girl is telling her that she had observed a fire out here with a shop. And Anthony and Leroy, that's his 2 stepsons, and some of the crazy friends dancing around the fire watching, waiting for the devil to come out. Bill asked her, said, "Did you see the devil come out?" "Oh yeah, he came out." He said, "What color was he?" "So he's blue." "Blue?" He wasn't red, but no, he's blue. Well, Bill made out a report, took it back to Sheriff Clyde. The sheriff was the sheriff of Kern County at that time. Well, he was already on the hot pursuit of this devil, you know. So when she turned in that report, he knew he was right all along. So he allotted $500,000 from the county of Kern to start digging. You know, he never dug up one, and how many acres of ground he dug up, I don't know. But he couldn't find one bone. The kids began to turn up alive. Everything was going wrong against him. So this Attorney General's report came out, and that was in September 1986. Would you believe, 17 years later, and that's today, not one child case is serviced. And the devil, Santana Coast, vanished overnight. Just a little over a year ago, I had a little happenings out at the ranch. David Sheriff come out there. He was about, I'd say, 50, 60 years old. Sitting there talking. He said, is this the Cox Ranch? I said, yeah. I said, why, you been with the sheriff's office a little while? He said, yeah. He said, I was one of the deputies hauling them boys around out here looking to go to those bad churches. I said, you were? He said, wait a minute, you're working, don't get me involved in this. He said, I'm retiring about a year, I don't want to get I said, well, what do you think about it? He said, it was a myth. He said, I didn't believe in that in the first place. I said, well, would you get up and talk about it now? No. Well, you know, that's kind of a little blow to the police department. I don't think I could serve a body of that issue that I had to hide something like that, you know. And these people are in prison and destroyed. You know, you can't bring this back. And I say like this, that when this witch hunt went on, that common sense went on vacation in Kern County. Because it's impossible, what they did, to me. I can't fathom that people would even believe it.
I remember you stating earlier about a judge coming to you saying he can prosecute you for not practicing law with a license. How far can you go without practicing law? I mean, it's like,
Well, now,
You went pretty far.
well, when I was in prison, I see, in 1970, there was a case come out, that's how we got started. There was a case come out, Avery versus Johnson, in the United States Supreme Court, that allotted one inmate to help another inmate. If one was a little more averse to the other, but he could help him. Well, is the Supreme Court going to cut it off right there? Why can't every citizen help another citizen? Would it be right with it? So, how's Kern County going to prosecute? I challenge him. Just like I tell you, he won't bother me. And,
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, how can we as citizens be more involved? It seems like it's almost like.
Oh, how can you
There's a
be
scaring us
involved?
with tactic. That's what I was like.
Yeah.
Like, I would love to be involved in a way where I can be able to help people. I mean, for what my job details right now, I try to help people rebuild people's
well,
lives.
while ago, you was a counselor over in correctional.
Yeah. And, but I also like to, if I had the opportunity, like for what you had, maybe.
I didn't have no opportunity that opportunity just come along.
Well, I guess it's more like a
the program was horrible.
opportunity of like, you saw something that you were talented at. That's what I mean by it. And you're still good at it, obviously.
Well, I look at it like this, from my situation, I got intrigued and I wouldn't lay down to what was happening. I just kind of, what do you call it, bullheaded and said I wasn't going to take home for national, not what happened. And wasn't going to quit, so I went. I started out to win, I'm going to win. See, I used to go in front of the board adult authority, and they tell me, well, sit down, Bert. I said, for what? I said, I don't recognize you. I said, yeah, you're not my keeper. I said, you don't have jurisdiction of me, and you did it illegal. And I said, I don't have to face you. I turned my back on him, and I said, that's the way here. I said, you can't trick me, do anything to me except deny me another year. You take me out, deny me another year, I'll take 5 of them. I haven't forgot it.
He did that because he was in prison when he shouldn't have been. And then, but there are, these, witch hunts is a term that, something I definitely wanted to make, at least he uses advisedly, because in so much, what happened in Kern County, has eerie resemblances to what happened in Salem, Massachusetts. And, for example, Gina Miller, in this case, with the 7th defendant, she was sort of like a throwaway defendant, and the prosecution urged her to testify against the other 6 people. She had 2 kids, and she was told that if she would appear and testify to affirm the county's view of what had happened, she would be out of prison within a year, and she would regain custody of her kids within 16 months. And she refused. Because she refused, she ended up getting a 423-year sentence to stay in prison, longer than any of the perpetrators. So too in Salem, if anybody who said they were a witch was not prosecuted, or they stated they weren't killed, they were prosecuted. The only people who were actually hanged or crushed with a rock were people who said, I'm not a witch, this is crazy. So the way in which people who came to the support of people accused of being witches were themselves prosecuted. It was exactly echoed